On a snowy evening in a quiet small-town backyard, 10-year-old Emily holds her young bobcat, Ash, limp in her arms. Suddenly his body convulses, foam spilling from his mouth. Neighbors gasp as Emily cries out for help. Just when she thinks she's saying her final goodbye, the vet leans closer and spots something chilling. A faint injection mark. This isn't illness. Someone wanted Ash dead. What Emily uncovers next will shake her entire town and put her own life at risk. Where are you watching from? If this moment moved you, like and subscribe for more true stories of courage, heartbreak, and hope. There are moments in every childhood that quietly divide life into a before and after. For Emily Langford, that moment arrived on a brittle afternoon in early November, when the mountains beyond her small Colorado town bristled with frost, and the golden light seemed almost reluctant to let go of the day. She'd wandered, as she often did, beyond the edge of Maple Hollow, a town so small you could hear your neighbor's dogs bark from a mile away, drawn by the hush of the pines and the promise of adventure. Her boots crunched over last summer's leaves. The air carried the smell of wood smoke and the sharp tang of snow waiting to fall. Most kids her age clung to the sidewalks, playing ball in backyards or scrolling through their phones. Not Emily. She found peace in the wild spaces, out where the woods pressed up against the town limits and the sunlight dappled through tall grass, making patterns that danced at her feet. It was here, just past the rusted remains of an old barbed wire fence, that her life veered into the unknown. At first she heard nothing but wind rattling the dry branches. Then a sound, so soft she nearly missed it, rose above the hush. It was not the call of a bird or the squeak of a squirrel, but something desperate, rough-edged, and raw. Emily froze, every sense reaching outward. Again, a muffled yowl, jagged and broken. She followed, heart knocking against her ribs, each step bringing her deeper into the thicket where the brambles grew thick and the sunlight grew thin. She found the source of the cry beneath a fallen log, tangled in brush. Her breath caught. There, huddled and trembling, was a young bobcat, small, thin, and caked with mud. The animal's fur, once golden with faint, dark spots, now clung in matted clumps to a body gaunt with hunger. One of its front paws was twisted beneath it, the pads swollen and raw. Its eyes, wide and wild, caught the last rays of the fading sun, shining back a mix of terror and exhaustion. Blood flecked its muzzle. It could not have been more than a few months old, but in the hard wilderness, even the young wore a look older than their years. A shiver ran through Emily that had nothing to do with the cold. She knew, every kid in Maple Hollow knew, the unwritten law. Never, under any circumstance, approach a wild bobcat. Their claws could open you up like a zipper. Their teeth could crush bone. Her father had warned her since she was little, telling stories of cats that stalked livestock, of eyes glowing on the edge of campfire light. But this animal she saw now was not a threat. It was fear and misery wrapped in spotted fur, too weak even to raise its head as she knelt beside it. For a moment, time seemed to pause, the world holding its breath. She could have run. She should have run. But something inside her refused to let the creature die alone. Her fingers trembled as she unzipped her coat and slipped it from her shoulders, lowering it gently over the bobcat's body. The animal flinched, teeth bared in a ghost of a snarl, but Emily only whispered, voice barely audible, "It's okay. I won't hurt you." She tucked the coat around the trembling form, her hands numb with cold and fear. The animal's heart pounded so hard she could feel it through the thin fabric. Slowly, with the patience of someone who has spent long hours earning the trust of stray animals, she slid her arms beneath the bobcat. The animal's body was shockingly light, bones pressing sharp against her palms. The claws, black and curved, pricked her sleeve, but the bobcat did not fight. Emily stood, gathering the bundle close, and turned back toward town. Every step was careful, each breath measured. Her mind raced with questions she could not answer. What had happened to this bobcat? Why was it so close to people, so far from where its kind belonged? And what could have left it so broken? As she crossed back into the neighborhood, lights twinkled from windows, and someone's radio played a song about lost love. The world remained oblivious to the secret cradled in Emily's arms. She moved along the back alleys, ducking beneath the glow of street lamps, heart hammering with the fear of being caught. If her father saw her now, if anyone saw, she would have no way to explain what she was doing. But the animal shivered against her chest, and she pressed onward, a silent promise growing in her heart. She would not let this creature die. She reached her house, a weathered blue cottage at the edge of the woods, and slipped through the back door, careful not to make a sound. Inside, the warmth hit her like a wave. The bobcat stirred, groaning softly. Emily set the bundle down in a box lined with old towels and sat nearby, watching as the animal's eyes flickered open and closed, struggling against sleep. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, or what dangers she might have invited into her life. But she knew this. Whatever had forced this wild, resilient creature so close to town, whatever had driven it to collapse at the edge of her world, was a mystery she could not ignore. And as the night crept in, Emily found herself caught at the crossroads of fear and wonder, unable to look away from the broken miracle at her feet. By sunrise, the world outside Emily's window was crisp with frost. Pale light spilled across her bedroom floor, illuminating the chaos she had brought home the night before. The young bobcat, still wrapped in her winter coat, slept in fitful spasms, its breathing shallow and uneven. Emily had barely slept. All night she'd hovered nearby, woken by every restless twitch, haunted by the memory of those wide, frightened eyes. She knew her parents would be up soon, and every passing minute felt like a countdown to disaster. It didn't take long. Her father's boots thumped across the kitchen floor, the familiar sound usually comforting but now heavy with dread. Emily braced herself as Daniel Langford entered the mudroom, ready to grab his tools and head out for his daily work on the town's snowplows. Instead, he stopped short, his eyes widening at the sight of his daughter crouched next to a wild animal in their laundry basket. For a moment, neither moved. Emily felt her father's shock, his disbelief, his fear. Daniel's voice came out hard and rough, the way it always did when he was scared for her. "Emily, what have you done?" She wanted to explain, to make him see what she had seen, the pain, the helplessness, the simple animal need for kindness. But Daniel was already shaking his head, running a hand through his hair. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, his worry pressed down like the weight of winter itself. "Bobcats aren't pets, Em," he said, voice tight. "They're wild, and they're protected. If someone finds out," she interrupted, pleading with her eyes, "Please, Dad, he's hurt. He'll die if we send him away now." But Daniel's fear wasn't just for the animal. It was for Emily, for the law, for the way even the purest intentions could go wrong. He crouched, careful to keep the laundry basket between himself and the bobcat. "We have to call animal control. There are rules about this. Emily shook her head, desperation rising inside her like a tide. She'd never been the kind of kid to shout or stamp her feet. She'd learned too early that grief was a silent thing, that arguments only made the world colder. But now something fierce woke in her. She squared her shoulders, her voice trembling but steady. "If you call them, they'll put him down. You know they will." Daniel's jaw tightened. For a moment he looked so much older, eyes tired, lines etched deep around his mouth, but he didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, leaving the room in silence that felt heavy enough to crush her. Emily turned her attention to the bobcat, smoothing the edge of her coat over his thin body. She could feel the wild, uneven drumbeat of his heart. Every instinct told her she was making a reckless, dangerous choice. But something deeper told her she could not walk away. Not when she'd already carried him so far. The house was tense all morning, her father moving through his routines in near silence. Emily scoured the kitchen for food that might tempt the bobcat. Bits of chicken, water in a shallow dish, while her mother lingered at the edge of things, torn between worry and the urge to trust her daughter. News traveled fast in Maple Hollow. By noon, word had already started to spread. Someone had seen a strange animal at the Langford house. Neighbors whispered as they passed the yard. One woman lingered too long at the end of their driveway, eyeing the windows, her phone in hand. Emily felt the world closing in. Every sound outside made her tense. She moved through the house like a shadow, checking on the bobcat, peering through curtains, waiting for the knock that would mean the end. It came, inevitably, just after lunch. Mr. Halbert, their neighbor from 3 doors down, appeared at the front porch, his eyes sharp and accusing. Daniel met him outside, but Emily heard every word through the cracked window. Halbert's voice was low, but the threat was clear. "You're not above the law, Dan. I know what your girl's hiding. If you don't call animal control, I will." The warning hung in the air long after Halbert left. Emily's heart pounded in her ears. She realized now that her secret was not just about a wounded animal. It was about standing against the world's rules, risking everything for a chance at mercy. It was in that moment that Spencer Delange came into their orbit. Emily didn't know his name, not then, but she recognized the way he watched from the edge of the woods, a stranger with hard eyes and the confidence of someone used to getting his way. She felt his gaze, cold as the mountain wind, lingering on the house. Later, she would learn the truth. Spencer was a collector, a trainer, and a trafficker. Someone who saw wild creatures not as lives but as prizes to be bought and sold. That evening, as Emily nursed the bobcat, whom she'd named Ash, for the color of his fur and the way he had almost burned out, she made her decision. She would protect Ash, no matter the cost. She would fight for him, even if it meant going against her father, her neighbors, even the law itself. Somewhere deep inside, a line had been crossed. There would be no turning back. As darkness settled over Maple Hollow and the cold pressed against the windows, Emily sat beside Ash, watching his slow, uneasy sleep. She understood, finally, what it meant to choose not just kindness, but courage, and how sometimes that choice set the world against you. For a few days, Emily lived in a fragile world balanced between hope and fear. The first hours after she named the bobcat Ash were the most delicate. Every sound from outside, every unexpected knock or raised voice made her pulse race. But the authorities never came, and neither did the neighbor with threats on his lips. Instead, the rhythm of daily life crept back, as if the storm had passed for good. Ash, for his part, was an uneasy houseguest. He lay curled in the laundry basket, or beneath the old oak table in the sunroom, his golden eyes always half-lidded but never truly at rest. He ate little, sometimes sniffing at the chicken or venison Emily set out, but often refusing it, his nose twitching with suspicion. He would hiss if Daniel came too close, ears pressed flat and tail lashing, but he seemed to accept Emily's presence. Tolerated, not trusted, but allowed. On afternoons when her mother was at work and her father preoccupied with chores, Emily sat on the floor, a respectful distance from the wild animal. She brought her school books or well-worn paperbacks and read aloud, her voice soft and steady, careful never to move too quickly or to reach out. Sometimes Ash's head would lift, his gaze flickering to her face, as if trying to make sense of the strange ritual. The air in the sunroom grew gentle, heavy with the unspoken truce between a girl who needed to save something and a wild creature that had never learned to trust. As days passed, Daniel's anger softened into resignation, and sometimes into something that looked like wonder. He would linger in the doorway, watching his daughter, seeing the steadiness she carried, even when the rest of the world seemed eager to collapse around them. He made no promises, offered no easy forgiveness, but he didn't call animal control. That was enough for Emily. She felt a tiny thread of hope weaving itself through the silence in their home. But it was all so fragile, peace balanced on the knife edge of what could go wrong. And soon, it did. It started on a Thursday morning. Emily woke to find Ash sitting up in the basket, eyes clearer, fur groomed with careful licks. He had eaten most of the meat she'd left, and even taken a few tentative sips of water. Her heart lifted. Maybe, she thought, she had done something right. Maybe the little bobcat would live. That sense of victory was short-lived. Later that day, while Emily read a chapter about mountain lions and wild forests, Ash suddenly staggered from his resting place. He moved clumsily, legs stiff and uncoordinated. His breathing grew ragged, and a thick strand of saliva dripped from his mouth. Emily's heart thudded. Before she could move, Ash collapsed, his body seizing in violent spasms on the floor. Fear shot through her like a live wire. She shouted for her father, voice cracking, as the bobcat thrashed and then went terribly still. The sunroom seemed to shrink, air thick and cold as ice water. Emily could barely hear her father's voice as he rushed in, only the sound of her own frantic heartbeat. Daniel knelt beside the animal, his hands shaking. Ash's eyes rolled back, lips flecked with foam. For a moment, Emily thought they had already lost him. Daniel swept the bobcat into a blanket and raced to the old pickup truck, engine roaring to life with a desperate cough. Emily watched from the window, too frozen to move, as her father sped down the winding mountain road. The day had started with hope and ended with the taste of panic in her mouth. The local vet, Dr. Hannah Renly, was the only person Daniel trusted with such an impossible problem. Her clinic sat at the edge of town, small and cluttered, full of the smells of disinfectant and fur. Dr. Renly met them at the door, her calm demeanor a steadying force as she carried Ash into the exam room. Emily sat on a hard plastic chair, knees drawn to her chest, listening as the adult spoke in hushed, urgent tones. The words drifted out. Poisoning. Seizures. Not natural. Emily felt herself shrinking, powerless to do anything but wait. The exam room door hung open just a crack, enough for her to catch glimpses of Dr. Renly's practiced hands and the bobcat's limp body on the steel table. Hours seemed to pass. When Dr. Renly finally emerged, her face was grim but not hopeless. She explained that Ash was not sick with any ordinary disease. She'd found a faint puncture on his hind leg, a tiny, almost invisible injection mark. It wasn't rabies or distemper. Someone had poisoned Ash using synthetic drugs often found in illegal animal trafficking. The bobcat had been targeted. Someone wanted him dead. For Emily, this revelation was a wound deeper than any she could see. She pictured the stranger in the woods, the rumors of men who captured wild things for money, the way her neighbors had watched the house with more than just curiosity. Suddenly, she saw the danger for what it was, not just to Ash, but to her family, her own small world. As night fell, Emily sat by Ash's side in the vet clinic, her fingers tangled in the edge of his blanket. She knew now that mercy would not be enough. Ash was caught in a storm much bigger than both of them, and the first flash of lightning had only just struck. Night at the animal clinic settled heavy and restless, thick with antiseptic and the soft whir of machines keeping Ash alive. Emily refused to leave the bobcat's side, numb with exhaustion, her thoughts racing through every possible outcome, none of them good. Ash lay motionless on the exam table, his sides barely rising, a faint pulse fluttering beneath spotted fur. Dr. Renly worked quietly, monitoring fluids and adjusting the IV drip, her calm presence the only thing that kept Emily from breaking down completely. Daniel paced the cramped waiting area, every few minutes glancing through the window into the back room where his daughter sat hunched beside the wild animal she had risked everything to save. He had never seen Emily so stubborn, so determined to shoulder the weight of something so dangerous and fragile. Grief, he realized, had shaped her, taught her about loss and about never turning away from something in need. It was a lesson he both admired and feared. Outside, the cold pressed against the clinic windows, the mountain wind howling as if it too sensed the storm about to break. Maple Hollow, usually quiet after dark, felt different tonight. Watchful, tense, as if the secrets of the woods had slithered into town. Daniel made a quick call to his wife, his voice low and clipped, telling her not to come to the clinic, to keep the doors locked and the lights off. He didn't mention the strangers who'd been watching the house, the uneasy sense that something more than gossip had followed them from the woods. In the early hours of the morning, with Emily dozing in a hard plastic chair and Dr. Renly scribbling notes by the glow of a desk lamp, a battered pickup pulled into the empty clinic lot. The headlights snapped off, and the driver lingered in the shadows. Had anyone else been awake, they might have recognized Spencer DeLange, the man whose business was wild animals, the man whose eyes always searched for opportunity, whose reputation was as cold and sharp as the mountains themselves. Inside, Emily startled awake as a floorboard creaked. For a moment, she was unsure if she'd truly heard it, her mind fogged with worry and sleep. Then the front door burst open with a violence that shattered the fragile peace of the clinic. Daniel barely had time to react. Two rough-looking men, led by Spencer, stormed inside, their faces hidden by hats pulled low and jackets zipped to the chin. The men moved fast. Spencer barked orders, his voice steely and without mercy. Daniel tried to intervene, but he was shoved aside, the wind knocked out of him. Dr. Renly stepped between the strangers and the back room, her body blocking the door, but Spencer's men forced their way through. Emily's heart hammered as she realized what was happening. This wasn't about the law or angry neighbors or gossip. This was about Ash. Someone had come to reclaim what they saw as theirs, and they would stop at nothing. Spencer's eyes, cold and calculating, settled on Emily for just a moment. She saw the recognition flicker there. The girl from the woods, the stubborn kid who dared to defy him. One of the men seized Emily's arm, rough and fast, dragging her away from the clinic lights and out into the freezing dark. She struggled, feet slipping on gravel, but the man's grip only tightened. Panic rose, wild and choking. She kicked out, tried to scream, but a hand clamped over her mouth, muffling her cries. They shoved her into the back of a waiting van parked near the tree line. The doors slammed shut, leaving her in total darkness. The air inside was thick with the smell of old hay, gasoline, and the copper tang of animal fear. Somewhere in the shadows, other cages rattled. Soft, desperate noises of creatures just as trapped as she was. Emily pressed herself against the cold metal wall, her mind racing through everything she'd ever been taught about survival, about hope. She counted the seconds by the beat of her heart, fighting not to give in to despair. Back at the clinic, chaos reigned. Daniel staggered to his feet, rage and terror blurring his vision, but Spencer and his men were already gone. Emily vanished, Ash left, barely clinging to life. Dr. Renly rushed to check on the Bobcat, her hands steady even as her own fear clawed at her insides. Ash was unresponsive, his breathing shallow, his eyes glassy and distant. She redoubled her efforts, cursing the men who had brought so much pain to a helpless animal and to a family already stretched thin by loss. Hours dragged by. Emily, locked in the back of the van, could hear the cries of animals all around her, a haunting chorus of fear and confusion. She realized she wasn't alone in her captivity. She was surrounded by foxes, raccoons, owls, and more, all stolen from their homes, all waiting for an uncertain fate. Despair pressed in, heavy and relentless, but somewhere beneath it burned a small, bright thread of anger. She would not let these men win. She would not let Ash's suffering be for nothing. In the frozen pre-dawn, as the town began to wake and the mountains glowed blue with coming day, the question hung over Maple Hollow like a thundercloud. Would Emily and Ash survive this night? Or would both disappear, one into the wild darkness, the other into the machinery of those who profited from the suffering of animals and children alike? The answer was far from certain. But Emily, trapped in darkness, refused to let go of hope. Ash's world was made of pain and shadow. Each breath scraped like broken glass through his lungs. Strange colors drifted behind his eyelids, memories mixing with nightmares. In flashes, he remembered warmth, the steady hum of Emily's voice reading stories, her gentle hands tucking blankets around him. But now the world was cold and bright and full of noise, machines beeping and voices moving in and out of his awareness. Dr. Renly never gave up, moving between the Bobcat and her cabinets, measuring doses, checking his heart. Daniel stood guard at the door, haunted by the memory of his daughter's abduction. Every minute stretched into hours. Daniel's mind replayed the violent struggle, his own helplessness as Spencer's men ripped Emily away, the last wild look in her eyes before she disappeared into the night. The loss hit deeper than fear. It was guilt and desperation twisted together. At first, they thought Ash was lost. His heartbeat fluttered, then stilled, his body limp and breath barely there. Dr. Renly forced herself to work on, hands steady though her mind screamed that the odds were against them. The injection site on Ash's leg confirmed the truth. He had been poisoned, not by accident, but with purpose. Someone wanted him dead, and now Emily was gone too. Maple Hollow was no longer a safe mountain town, but the center of a storm no one had seen coming. But nature, when cornered, often surprises. Near dawn, as the first blue light seeped through the clinic windows, Ash's body jerked suddenly. He thrashed wildly, claws scraping the metal cage, a primal energy surging through him. Dr. Renly and Daniel rushed to the enclosure, fearing he might injure himself beyond saving. Acting on instinct, Dr. Renly flung open the cage door, desperate to prevent Ash from shattering his own bones. Ash bolted. The bobcat shot through the open window in a blur of motion, the wildness returning in an explosion of panic and survival. Daniel tried to follow, but was too slow. Dr. Renly hurried outside, scanning the frosted grass for paw prints. They tracked Ash's trail out into the woods, footprints weaving through thickets and icy streams, a desperate, wandering path. It was while following this trail that Daniel noticed something odd. A series of tire tracks, unusual for that remote part of town, cut deep into the frozen earth. Bits of fur and discarded syringes lay half-hidden among the rocks. A shed sat hidden beneath a stand of pines, its lock broken and the ground around it stamped flat by many boots. Daniel knelt, brushing aside pine needles to reveal cages stacked and chained, some empty, some streaked with blood and old straw. He exchanged a look with Dr. Renly. This was no longer just about a sick bobcat. The pieces fell into place. Rumors of missing pets, shadowy figures glimpsed along the highway, the cold, watchful eyes of Spencer DeLange. The town's wildlife wasn't just disappearing. It was being hunted, collected, and shipped out by a network hidden in plain sight. Back in the darkness, Emily struggled against her bonds. The men had locked her in a tool shed at the edge of town, surrounded by the muffled whimpers and rattles of caged animals. She listened, heart pounding, for any sound of rescue. At first she hoped her father might find her, or that the police would storm in, but as the hours dragged by, hope gave way to determination. She remembered survival lessons, how to keep calm, how to wait for the right moment. But as the cold seeped into her bones and the cries of the animals pressed in, Emily realized she couldn't depend on anyone else. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to save Ash and the rest of the animals, she would have to act. Her mind worked through every possibility. She scanned the dark room for anything useful. Nails scattered on the floor, a shard of glass beneath an old tarp, the faint glimmer of a window high on the far wall. The door, though heavy, was old and the hinges rusted. She tried to loosen the ropes binding her wrists against a splintered crate, her movements slow and deliberate. Time lost meaning. Every sound outside was a threat, every shadow a possible rescue or a new danger. Suddenly, from the distance, a wild yowl rose, half scream, half warning. Emily's heart leapt. She pressed her face to the crack in the wall, searching for movement in the yard. She caught the faintest glint of fur as Ash, wild-eyed and wounded, slunk through the brush. The bobcat had returned, not as a pet, but as a creature desperate for sanctuary and kin. She called out softly, not daring to raise her voice, hoping the animal would recognize her scent. At that same moment, Daniel and Dr. Renly found a bloodied collar snagged on the fence and the remnants of tranquilizer darts. This was evidence, proof that someone was stealing and abusing wildlife. They followed the path deeper into the forest, hearts heavy with fear for Emily and rage for the cruelty inflicted on so many voiceless animals. As dawn brightened the world beyond the shed, Emily realized her window of escape had arrived. If she could loosen the ropes, if she could draw Ash close enough, perhaps together they could outwit Spencer and his men. She refused to surrender, even with fear clawing at her. The truth had been revealed about Ash, about the trafficking ring, about the danger surrounding them all. It was time to fight back, with courage sharp as any wild animal's claw. The shed was a prison of shadows, damp and cold. Emily's wrists burned where the ropes chafed, but her mind was awake and sharp. All around her, the quiet desperation of the captive animals filled the darkness. A chorus of soft whimpers, the clatter of a chain, the flutter of wings against metal wire. Time slowed to the drip of condensation from the ceiling and the ache in her arms. She studied the lock on her cage, remembering what her father had always said. Sometimes you had to wait for the world to give you one small chance, and then you had to be brave enough to take it. Outside, the sounds of Spencer's men drifted closer. Boots crunching over gravel, a burst of angry laughter. It wouldn't be long before someone checked on her. Every instinct screamed at her to hurry. Her eyes caught a glimmer near her feet. The faint edge of a small, cracked mirror wedged between two boards. Spencer must have dropped it without noticing. Emily managed to shift her position, contorting herself until her fingers brushed the cold glass. The mirror was no weapon, but it could send a signal. She waited, counting heartbeats, until a shaft of early morning sunlight filtered through the boards. She angled the mirror, sending a trembling beam of light through the crack in the wall, hoping that someone might see. In the woods, Ash moved like a ghost, silent but for the faint rustle of leaves under his paws. Pain still pulsed in his wounded leg, but a new energy burned in his chest. He picked up Emily's scent, faint but mixed with fear and the acrid tang of gasoline and men. It drew him closer to the edge of the clearing, where the old van and a battered pickup idled, ready for another run. Spencer was shouting orders, his words snapping with impatience. Inside the shed, Emily heard the commotion. Trucks starting, cages banging against metal. Through the thin wall, she pieced together the truth. The animals were being loaded for transport. Tonight, there would be no second chances. If she waited any longer, Ash and all the others would be lost. She twisted, grinding the rope against a rusty nail until the fibers frayed. At last, the knot slipped, and she was free. Her heart pounded, but she didn't let fear slow her. She slipped to the door, testing it, still locked. But Spencer, in his hurry, had left a ring of keys hanging from a nail. Emily stretched, the tips of her fingers barely brushing the cold metal. Another stretch, a silent prayer, and the keys dropped into her hand. She worked quickly, unlocking her own cage first, then moving to the cages nearest to her. Raccoons blinked at her in confusion. A hawk ruffled its wings, and a pair of terrified foxes pressed against the wire. She worked her way through the line, unlocking what she could, listening all the while for footsteps or a raised voice. Suddenly, the door burst open. Emily froze as Spencer's shadow filled the threshold, his eyes narrowing in shock and anger. He raised a tranquilizer gun, the weapon aimed straight at her. The animals sensed the danger. Panic exploded through the shed. The hawk screeched, foxes clawed at the door, and Ash, drawn by the chaos, launched himself from the shadows. In the blur of motion, Emily made a choice. She could run, slip out the back and into the woods, maybe make it to safety, but the cries of the caged animals were too much. She dove forward instead, unlocking the last row of cages. Foxes bolted for freedom. The hawk flapped desperately toward the open window, and Ash hurled himself at Spencer's legs. Spencer stumbled, firing the dart gun wildly. The shot missed Emily by inches, the dart embedding in the wall. Ash slashed at Spencer's arm, drawing a streak of blood. The man cursed, kicking at the bobcat. In the confusion, Emily grabbed Spencer's dropped phone and bolted toward the nearest door. She could hear sirens in the distance, a sound like hope, like help on the way. But Spencer wasn't done. He lunged at Emily, dragging her backward, his grip iron tight. The shed rattled with the panic of dozens of animals, their fear a living thing. Emily fought back, twisting and scratching, refusing to give in. Ash, limping but furious, circled, searching for a new opening. The world shrank to noise and pain, footsteps, the crackle of radios, Spencer's curses. Emily kicked free for an instant, darting behind the cages. She saw the light of morning streaming through a broken window and knew that was her only chance. She dove, Ash beside her, both of them racing for freedom as the first police cars screeched into the clearing. Spencer turned to flee, leaving chaos in his wake. Emily tumbled into the cold grass, lungs burning, Ash at her side. They had made it out, for now, but the fight was far from over. The world was watching, and this time, she would not run away. The clearing behind the shed erupted in chaos, morning sunlight flashing on metal and fur as every cage sprang open, flooding the yard with frightened, desperate creatures. Sirens split the quiet of the mountain, red and blue lights strobing across the pine trunks as the first patrol car lurched to a stop by the old pickup. For a single, suspended heartbeat, Emily was frozen in the tall grass. Ash crouched protectively at her side, the thundering of her heart nearly drowning out the panic all around her. Spencer DeLange stood in the shed's broken doorway, one arm streaked with blood from Ash's claws, the tranquilizer gun wavering as he scanned the yard. He looked almost feral himself, jaw clenched, breath ragged, years of cruelty distilled into a single moment. His plan was crumbling. Animals scattered, his phone lost, sirens screaming, but he still had one weapon left. Emily ducked low, scrambling across the grass with Ash close behind as Spencer's shadow fell over them. He leveled the tranquilizer gun at her, finger tightening on the trigger. For an instant, she felt only fear, cold and pure. But then something inside her shifted. All the weeks of worry and heartbreak, all the loss she'd carried since her mother's accident, hardened into a bright point of courage. She kept moving, zigzagging through the stampede of animals. The bobcat darted in front of her, teeth bared in a silent snarl, every muscle coiled to strike. Spencer fired. The dart whistled past Emily's ear, lodging harmlessly in a tree trunk. Spencer cursed, stepping forward, only to be knocked off balance as a pair of panicked raccoons burst from the shed, tumbling into his legs. Ash seized the opening. He leaped, claws flashing, and landed squarely on Spencer's arm. The man roared, dropping the gun as Ash raked deep scratches along his wrist. In that flash of pain and confusion, Emily lunged for the fallen weapon, but her hand landed on Spencer's lost phone instead. She grabbed it, hands shaking, and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. The operator's voice was a lifeline through the mayhem. She blurted the address, pleading for help, not caring how jumbled her words sounded. All around her, chaos grew, foxes bounding into the trees, the hawk swooping through the broken window, cages clattering as animals scrambled for the woods. Spencer recovered, fury burning in his eyes, and lunged at Emily. But Ash was faster. With a guttural yowl, the bobcat threw himself at Spencer again, this time sinking his teeth into the man's ankle. Spencer stumbled, clutching at Ash and losing his balance, tumbling to the ground. Emily scrambled backward, the phone still pressed to her ear. The police surged into the clearing, weapons drawn, voices booming. "Drop it! Hands up!" Spencer, caught in the act, struggled to his feet, one hand pressed to his bleeding leg. For a moment, Emily thought he might run, might disappear into the brush with the rest of the wild things. But Ash blocked his path, teeth bared, eyes wild and unwavering. It wasn't brute strength that held Spencer back. It was the sudden certainty that he'd lost control. The world had closed in, the rules he'd twisted finally snapping shut around him. Emily saw the fear in his eyes, mingling with hatred and a desperate, wounded pride. The officers rushed forward, cuffing Spencer and dragging him away from the shed, his protests drowned by the cries of freed animals and the sharp calls for backup. Emily collapsed into the grass, exhausted, as relief crashed over her in dizzying waves. Ash limped to her side, body trembling, but alive. The aftermath blurred into a rush of activity. Police corralled the last of the animals, veterinarians and volunteers arriving to help with the wounded and frightened. Dr. Renly, having tracked the commotion from the trail, found Emily wrapped in a blanket. Ash pressed close at her side. The two were taken to safety, Emily finally able to breathe, to feel the world slow down around her. As she watched Spencer shoved into the back of a patrol car, Emily didn't feel triumphant. She felt changed. The danger hadn't vanished. The scars would remain. But she had faced it head-on, choosing courage over fear, compassion over indifference. The girl who once hid in the woods from her grief had found her strength in the fight for something she believed in. Ash lay beside her, golden eyes half closed, battered but alive. Their bond, forged in desperation and trust, had carried them both through the darkest night. As the morning sun rose higher, warming the clearing and painting the world in gold, Emily whispered a silent promise to the wild creature who had changed her life. No matter what came next, she would never stop fighting for the voiceless, the lost, the wild things that needed someone to stand beside them. By late afternoon, the chaos in the clearing had faded to a heavy quiet. Police officers worked methodically, cataloging evidence, taking statements, guiding the last rescued animals toward makeshift shelters erected by local volunteers. In the muddled swirl of lights and movement, Emily found herself both at the center and somehow apart, a witness to a whirlwind that had upended her life and left her trembling with exhaustion, hope, and fear. Dr. Renly never left her side, keeping a watchful eye on both Emily and Ash. The bobcat, battered and bleeding from the standoff with Spencer, moved only when necessary. He pressed himself against Emily, too weary to protest as the vet examined his wounds, checking for broken bones, cleaning the deep gashes along his flank. Ash's golden eyes had lost their wild panic. Now they flickered with a dull trust and pain, his sides heaving in shallow breaths as the adrenaline faded and the ache of injuries settled in. Emily held Ash's head gently, murmuring reassurance, barely noticing the paramedics tending to her own bruises. She was only dimly aware of the townspeople arriving. Neighbors, strangers, local reporters drawn by the sirens and the wild rumors swirling through Maple Hollow. She heard her father's voice above the din, strained but overflowing with relief, and finally let herself sag into his arms. For a moment, she was only a child again, clinging to the safety she'd nearly lost. But reality returned with the arrival of state officials, wildlife agents in crisp uniforms, carrying clipboards and stern expressions. Their questions were clinical, focused not on heroism, but on rules, liability, the law. Emily watched their faces tighten when they saw Ash, the marks of captivity still raw on his body, the blood on his muzzle and paws. Their voices carried the finality of decisions made far away, by people who had never knelt beside a dying bobcat in the cold night. Dr. Renly tried to plead Ash's case, laying out the facts. The animal had been targeted by traffickers, had fought for survival, had become a symbol of courage and connection in a community that needed hope. Daniel argued, too, that Ash belonged with the family who'd risked everything for him, that Emily had proven her heart was strong enough for the responsibility. But the agents shook their heads. The law was the law. Wild animals, especially those injured and traumatized, could not stay in private homes. Sanctuary was the only option. Emily felt the words as a physical blow. She stared at Ash, tears burning in her eyes, desperate for one last miracle. But the answer never changed. She saw it in the slow shake of Dr. Renly's head, the gentle squeeze of her father's hand. No amount of pleading would sway the rule books. Ash would be sent to a wildlife sanctuary, far from the house on Maple Lane, far from the girl who had carried him home and fought for his life. The victory that had felt so absolute in the chaos of the rescue now curdled into loss. Emily watched as the wildlife agents lifted Ash into a special carrier, their voices low, movements careful but impersonal. She knelt beside the crate, pressing her fingers through the wire to touch Ash's fur, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. He blinked at her, slow and heavy, his trust unbroken even as the world took him away once more. The sun slid behind the pines, throwing long shadows across the yard. The crowd melted away, leaving only the family, Dr. Renly, and the last echoes of the day's struggle. Emily sat on the porch steps, the blanket still around her shoulders, watching as the van with Ash disappeared up the winding mountain road. Her father settled beside her, saying nothing, offering the only comfort he could, a silent presence in the space grief had carved between them. For days after, Emily wandered the house in a daze. She washed Ash's towels, scrubbed the old laundry basket, found stray bits of fur in the corners of the sunroom. The rescue had become a sensation. Local news, internet headlines, calls from reporters wanting the story of the Bobcat girl. But Emily didn't care about fame. Her victory tasted hollow. The price of doing what was right felt impossibly high. Dr. Renly visited often, bringing updates from the sanctuary where Ash had been taken. The bobcat was recovering slowly, learning to trust new caretakers, finding his place in a world that asked him to be wild again. Emily and her father were allowed to visit, sometimes standing for hours by the fence as Ash prowled the edge of the forest enclosure, sometimes stopping to look back at the girl who had changed his life as surely as he had changed hers. It was not the ending Emily had imagined, not the storybook reunion or perfect happy ever after. But she learned, painfully, that some victories come with losses that cannot be undone. She had saved Ash's life, had exposed cruelty and changed her community. But to do so, she had to let go of what she loved most. And in the quiet that followed, she began to understand what it meant to fight for the freedom of another, even when it broke her heart. As autumn waned and the first hints of winter crept down from the mountains, Emily walked the long path to the sanctuary fence and pressed her hand against the cold wire, watching Ash slip into the trees. She whispered goodbye, not as surrender, but as a promise. Love, she realized, sometimes meant letting go so that those you cared for could finally find their place in the world. Life in Maple Hollow changed in subtle ways after that autumn. Emily returned to school, her days filled once more with math quizzes, cafeteria chatter, and the slow crawl of homework under yellow lamplight. To the outside world, she seemed like any other 10-year-old, quiet, polite, a little more thoughtful than her classmates. but ordinary in the ways that let people overlook grief and courage when it didn't fit their own stories. But Emily's world had grown wider and stranger, colored by memories of the wildness she'd carried home in her arms and the pain of letting it go. Her fame faded quickly. The news vans packed up, the headlines vanished beneath newer, louder stories. But in Maple Hollow, the tale of the Bobcat girl became something different. A whispered legend passed between children and retold by adults over mugs of coffee and steaming cider. Sometimes, Emily would catch strangers studying her in the grocery store, or neighbors stopping in their driveways as she passed. Some looked at her with admiration, others with suspicion, as if kindness toward wild things was a dangerous lesson for children to learn. But in the quiet heart of her home, life was softer and slower. Daniel tried to return to his old routines, but something had shifted between father and daughter, a deeper, quieter understanding. He was quicker to listen, slower to anger. He trusted Emily's instincts, even when he didn't always understand them. They talked more, sometimes about her mother, sometimes about what it meant to be brave in small, everyday ways. They learned how to grieve together, to share the weight of what had been lost and found. Emily missed Ash with an ache that never really faded. She wandered the woods on weekends, tracing the trails they had both followed. She on 2 feet, Ash in silent, 4-footed grace. She would pause by the fallen log where she'd first found him, kneeling in the brush to listen to the wind or the distant, secret rustle of something moving through the undergrowth. Sometimes she imagined that Ash watched her from the shadows, a silent guardian of the wildness that lingered at the edges of her world. Visiting the sanctuary became a ritual, once a week at first, then whenever her father's work allowed. The facility sat on the other side of the county, a patchwork of meadows and forest, high fences and quiet trails. The first visit was the hardest. Emily worried that Ash wouldn't remember her, that the bond they'd forged in crisis would have been swept away by the return of instinct and the pull of freedom. But when she arrived, Ash emerged from the underbrush, moving with that same wounded grace, his golden eyes fixed on the girl at the fence. There was no reunion in the way movies promised, no leap into her arms, no tears or dramatic music. Ash simply sat a few feet away, watching her through the wire. Emily pressed her hand to the cold metal, her heart full of things she would never find words for. They sat in silence, and it was enough. She saw in his eyes not just gratitude, but understanding, a wild creature's acceptance of the way life moves forward, sometimes through pain, sometimes through grace. Over time, Emily grew stronger. She helped Dr. Renly at the clinic, learning the basics of animal care, listening to stories about foxes and owls, hawks and rabbits. She learned that courage wasn't always about dramatic rescues or standing up to villains in the woods. Sometimes, courage meant facing ordinary days with kindness, letting herself be changed by what she'd lost and what she still hoped to find. Her classmates, sensing the change, treated her with a mixture of awe and caution. Some were curious, asking about the bobcat, about the night of sirens and flashing lights. Others avoided her, as if contact might bring the wildness too close to their own carefully ordered lives. Emily learned to let those reactions pass. She no longer needed to explain herself. The story she carried was hers alone, a quiet proof that even the smallest person could make a difference, even if it came at a cost. Daniel visited the sanctuary too. At first he stood at a distance, hands in pockets, watching Ash through narrowed eyes. But over time he softened. He would bring scraps from home, bits of meat, toys from the shed, and stand beside Emily, silent and respectful. Together, they watched Ash grow stronger, more confident in his new world. They saw him disappear into the trees, reappearing only when he chose. Emily understood now that love didn't always mean keeping. Sometimes, the most important thing you could do for someone, or something you loved, was to let them go. To give them the chance to find their own place, their own freedom. She saw that lesson echoed in her father's eyes, in the way the town slowly shifted toward protecting its wild places, in the quiet pride Dr. Renly carried after every rescued animal left the clinic for a new beginning. By the time winter settled into Maple Hollow, Emily felt older, not in years, but in the deep, quiet way that comes from facing heartbreak and not running from it. She was not the same girl who had walked the edge of the woods that first day, chasing adventure out of loneliness and longing. She was braver now, more open to the world and all its wild, beautiful risks. She never forgot Ash, and as the snow began to fall, covering the mountains in white silence, Emily promised herself she would always be ready to help, to fight for the lost and the voiceless, no matter how much it hurt to let them go. The seasons turned, as they always do. Winter's hush softened the world, blanketing Maple Hollow in white, the mountains rising beyond the rooftops like silent guardians. Emily learned to walk slowly through the snow, following the delicate prints of rabbits and deer. She looked for signs of wildness everywhere now, in the flicker of a hawk's wings above the pines, in the secret tunnels of mice beneath the crusted ice, in the deep blue silence that fell each night. Every shadow held a memory, every sunrise a quiet promise. At home, Emily's life found a new rhythm. Mornings began with the smell of wood smoke and her father's quiet humming as he made breakfast. There was less fear between them now, less of the unspoken sorrow that once haunted their days. Instead, they shared the comfort of ordinary moments, tending the woodpile, fixing squeaky doors, trading stories over steaming bowls of oatmeal. Sometimes they would fall silent, a gentle peace settling over the table, a wordless understanding that together they could weather whatever storms might come. Emily's heart still ached for Ash, but the pain was gentler now. It was not the raw, desperate loss of those first days after the sanctuary van drove away. It was softer, shaped by gratitude and memory, by the knowledge that what she had done mattered, even if it could not last forever. She dreamed of him often, a shadow slipping through the trees, eyes bright with intelligence and forgiveness. When she woke, she felt less alone. The visits to the sanctuary became a sacred ritual, a bridge between the world of humans and the untamable wild. On weekends, Daniel would drive her along the winding roads, past snow-dusted farms and frozen creeks, to the patch of forest where Ash now roamed. The sanctuary had grown, thanks in part to the town's new attention and generosity. People donated supplies, built new enclosures, and volunteered time. What began as a story of danger and heartbreak had become a spark, one that lit up the whole community. Standing by the tall fence, Emily would watch Ash moving in his new kingdom. Sometimes he appeared quickly, pacing along the edge of the woods, golden fur vivid against the snow. Sometimes she would wait for an hour or more, patient and still, feeling the cold seep through her boots. But always, Ash came. He would pause just within sight, his gaze meeting hers through the mesh. They no longer needed to touch, or speak, or even come close. Between them stretched a bond forged by courage and sacrifice, a silent promise that each had done what was needed, even when it hurt. Other children came to visit, pressed by curiosity and wonder. Emily would tell them the story, not as a tale of heroism but as a lesson in love and letting go. She showed them how to listen for wildness, how to see with patient eyes, how to recognize that some things cannot and should not be tamed. The bobcat became a symbol for the town, a reminder that what we fear, what we try to control, is often what most needs our respect and freedom. Maple Hollow began to change, quietly but surely. Neighbors who had once gossiped about the Langfords now joined in efforts to protect the woods at the town's edge. Trails were marked and cleaned. Signs were posted, warning against poaching and illegal trapping. Daniel found himself speaking at town meetings, his voice steady and certain, sharing what he had learned from his daughter. Dr. Renly started a wildlife rescue group, teaching others how to care for animals in crisis and how to fight for laws that mattered. Emily saw all of this with pride, but she never forgot the cost. Love, she knew now, was not about possession or control. It was about seeing another's needs clearly, about giving up comfort and certainty so that something beautiful and wild could thrive. Sometimes, doing the right thing meant accepting sorrow as well as joy, trusting that the world would go on, stronger and kinder for your sacrifice. As spring arrived, Emily made one last visit to the sanctuary before the school year ended. She stood at the fence, watching as Ash melted into the new green of the forest, his tail flicking in farewell. She didn't call out, didn't beg him to come close. She only smiled, knowing that what had passed between them would live on, not just in memory, but in every small act of courage and kindness she carried into the world. On the way home, Daniel asked her quietly if she would ever want to go back, to take another chance with a wild creature. Emily thought for a long moment, watching the mountains slide by, the sunlight breaking through the clouds. Finally, she answered, not with words, but with a certainty in her heart. She knew she would always listen for wild cries in the woods. She knew she would always answer. The story of Emily and Ash became part of Maple Hollow's soul, a lesson whispered to children on stormy nights, a hope passed from neighbor to neighbor. In a world where people so often tried to hold tight to what they loved, the girl and the bobcat taught them a different kind of courage, the kind that lets go, that sets free, that trusts the wild to find its own way home. And as Emily grew older, she carried that lesson with her, reminding herself and everyone she met that sometimes, to truly protect what you love, you must be brave enough to let it go.